morning, and welcome to another episode of messing with the phone here. Another episode of Jeff's Drive Time Rant. I'm on my way home from work this morning. You can probably tell by the bags under my eyes I had a rough night. Anyway, I wanted to talk about disciplining your children. You know, what's the best way to discipline your children? And well, really more than that, I want to talk about spanking. To spank or not to spank, or to beat or not to beat. You know, spanking sounds so much kinder and gentler. But I've recently had a major shift in my thinking concerning this issue, because I used to be one of those, that believed spare the rod, spoil the child, and all those sorts of things. And I am, if you've listened to me at all, you know that I'm a Bible believer. And so there's a couple verses in the Bible that spare the rod, spoil the child is not in the Bible, by the way, but there are a couple verses in the Proverbs that Solomon wrote about, if you beat your child, beat your son or whatever, he will not die, this, that, or the other. You'll save his soul from hell, I think in chapter 13, 23, and 24, and I don't have those memorized, so I can't quote them for you, but anyway, there's more on that in a minute. But my sister had been telling me, as a libertarian, I'm also a libertarian, and I fully accept and believe in the non-aggression principle. And so spanking your children, of course, would be inconsistent with that. I mean, that's aggression. But they're your children, and when you're raised in a culture that teaches that, the spare the rod, spoil the child mentality, and believe me, I was spanked a lot, quite a bit. I had two younger brothers, and we were always into mischief, and my dad was a dyed-in-the-wool Southern Baptist preacher. And he definitely believed in the mantra of spare the rod, spoil the child. And anyway, we got plenty. And, Dad always told stories about, the discipline, if you want to call it that. It's corporal punishment would be what, would be a more appropriate. About the punishment, the spankings, the whoopings he got from his dad, and I imagine his dad told him stories about the whoopings he got from his dad, and, it's kind of this rite of passage thing, but, and I never really thought a lot about it, I know that there were times when, sure, it definitely made you as a child, made you very angry, more afraid than angry, more than anything. Now, my youngest brother, he definitely had anger issues about it. I probably should tell him about this post. Of course, he knows, we've talked about it. Yeah, my dad definitely went overboard with him, in my opinion. And he went overboard with me and my other brother, too, a couple times, I would say. But, I mean, I love my dad to death. I think the world of him. And, he's deceased now, but I thought the world of him. And I miss him deeply. And I think he was a great man. In spite of, what some people would call brutality. I never thought of it as brutality, and because I myself was brainwashed into thinking that this was appropriate. This was an appropriate form of correction. And in fact, I really, I was a child of the 70s, and, you had Dr. Spock about that time. I don't remember, it was the, mid to late 70s. He had written a book about discipline and, not spanking your children and all this. And, most people in evangelical circles and all that thought that he was nuts. We had some friends that subscribed to it, or I should say my mom and dad had friends that subscribed to Spock's style of child rearing and discipline, etc. And their kids were awful. I mean, they were awful. And so I remember even thinking, I was a teenager at that time, so we pretty much, I didn't. After I became a teenager, I don't recall ever having gotten a spanking. But I remember this family that I'm referring to, who will remain nameless. They didn't spank their children, and they were younger. They were younger than us. They were still, they were still adolescents. And anytime you went out to dinner with these people, or anytime they came over, their kids were terrors. They were awful. And so that was my idea of, or my concept of people that didn't spank their children had unruly children. I just assumed that that's the way it was. But I've learned in more recent years that that's not necessarily true. And I read a book just a while back. Now my before I go into that, my children are all, my youngest is 18, so I'm pretty much done with that. And my children, my oldest got it the worst. It seems like that's always the case. But my children were spanked very little. Especially our second and third. My first, it was actually my second. Our first actually passed away when she was 2. Not to be a downer or anything. I'm not trying to bring you down, but I'm just trying to explain. My first wasn't actually my first. She was my second. But it was probably about the terrible 2s, when it all started. And I definitely had lost my cool more than once with her. And she can recall that too as well, unfortunately. So, that's not a good thing. Of course, at that time, I still adhered to, what I thought were biblical principles in child rearing, Of course, I always loved her and let her know that I care for her after I spanked her and all that sort of stuff. But, nonetheless, there were a couple times that I can think of when I did get a little bit carried away. And so anyway, I'm not trying to air out my dirty laundry here. But anyway, I have since come to understand, number one, the Bible in a different way. And it's not that it doesn't say what it says. It's all about context. It's all about rightly dividing the word of truth and understanding that what was written in the Proverbs, number one, was written to the Jews who were under the law program. And as it was pointed out to me, under the law program, a child, a son, if a son cursed his father, he was to be put to death. Okay, so adulterers were to be put to death. And they did have corporal punishment, not just for children, but for people as well. It was, God required him. It was very harsh. The law program that God laid out for Israel was harsh. And there was a reason for it. And I'm not going to go into all that right here. But the dispensation of the law and Israel's program with God, they had made a promise, they had made a covenant with God that they would keep the law, and said with one voice that they could keep the law perfectly. They could and would keep it. And so God held them to that. And he said, here's what's going to happen if you don't. And so what happened if they don't was severe. Because it was extremely important that they kept the law. Of course, God knew that they couldn't keep the law, which is what the sacrificial system was all about, which was pointing, ultimately to another sacrifice that actually would take away sins. But, what the law was given for was to show Israel that this is what's required for perfection. This is God's standard. So if you're going to live up to God's standard, and that was their choice, understand that. It was their choice. God, it wasn't God's choice to give them the law. He gave them the law, but then what he expected was that they would be humble and say, oh, Lord, we cannot keep this. This is too much. But instead, that isn't what they said. They were arrogant, and they thought that they could keep it. So anyway, there were stiff penalties. Let's just put it that way, for breaking the law. But there was also mercy, and there was grace, and there was an escape, if they would just admit that they couldn't keep it, and repent of the fact that they had broken their covenant, which they swore that they would keep. God had a way out for them. So anyway, understanding that and who the law was written for, then when you go back to the book of Proverbs and look at chapter 13 verse, or no, it's either chapter 13 verses 23 and 24, or it's chapter 23 verses 13 and 14. I ain't sure which. I'll have to look it up. But anyway, you can look it up. When you understand the context that Solomon wrote that in, and that it was written to the children of Israel, and it has nothing to do with us today in the dispensation of grace, or nothing to do with anybody that wasn't a Jew for that matter. No, the Gentiles weren't under the law. So understanding that as a believer, as a Bible believer, you have to be careful not to take stuff written to somebody else, under the law program, and apply it to yourself today. We're in the dispensation of the grace of God, that was given to Paul, the Apostle Paul. And we're under grace, not law. And the law was nailed to the cross, and our sins were nailed to the cross. They were put on Christ. So anyway, let's get back to the child discipline thing, the spanking. So with that in mind, I am absolutely convinced that the Bible doesn't teach that we should spank our children. Nowhere in Paul's writings, nor in the New Testament, does it talk about spanking your children. It talks about correcting them. It talks about not provoking them to wrath. Don't correct your children by, yelling and screaming at them and making them mad. That's not a way to teach. You're not going to teach them anything by doing that. And as this pastor friend of mine, Kurt Chris, said, it's all about time. And the problem is in our culture, in our puritanical culture, so many things that we've gotten, especially in America, have been handed down to us, by tradition, that actually aren't biblical. And just like the saying, spare the rod, spoil the child, we which, like I said before, isn't even in the Bible. So, yeah, we have to be careful. But it's about time. It's about spending the time with your children to teach them, to correct them. And you don't correct them using brutality. I'm convinced of that. I used to rationalize, and I said this to my sister when she started trying to tell me that. I convinced her and my brother-in-law and half my family that, libertarian principles are really, especially in the political realm and for society at large, are in my opinion, the best system there is. But, as far as a socioeconomic system. And, of course, this is from man's standpoint, libertarianism. I think that's the best that men can come up with. It's not the best that God could come up with, of course. As I often say, we won't have any peace in this world until the Prince of Peace, till he comes. And, a benevolent king would actually be the best system, but that king would have to be a perfect king. And there's only one that could be that. So until that time, I really like libertarianism. I really think that it has a lot to offer. And the principles, in fact, really line up with God's word. The non-aggression principle is the fundamental principle of libertarianism. You don't have a right to aggress against others, persons, or property. Simple as that. Except for in the case of self-defense. You cannot use violence or coercion, against other and their property. Don't lie, cheat, steal, kill. It's the fundamentals. It's the Ten Commandments. It's very basic. So when it comes to your children, it's still no different. I had a hard time convincing myself and being convinced because when I thought about, I rationalized that, how do you deal with a 2-year-old? How do you rationalize with a 2-year-old? And my example was, or my analogy was, if a 2-year-old's about to grab the handle of a very hot pot off the stove, like a pot full of water, boiling water, it was my theory that, look, if they start to reach for it, you grab them, give them a little swat on the butt and say, no, don't do that. And, a swat on the butt is, to be greatly preferred as to getting your skin boiled off was my theory. And in fact, my son did that when he was younger. I can't remember how he was 4 or 5 years old, and his mother kept telling him, don't touch that, don't touch that. She had boiled water in a glass pot, I believe it was, or a glass bowl in the microwave. So, it was really hot. He's got scars. He's 21 years old, and he has scars all over his shoulders to this day from it. She kept telling him, so would I rather that happen to my child, or would I rather spank them? That was my justification. Spank them, that's a minor pain compared to, the harm that can come to them. So that was my theory, and, my philosophical belief, if you will. But, like I said, I since then, I've changed my mind, and I never thought I'd say that. But I don't think it's some liberal lefty ideal, to not use corporal punishment. But that is what I used to think. So I don't think that anymore. I really don't. I think there is a better way. But it takes time. And as Pastor Kurt said, he said that's the problem, which is easier. Oh, a lot easier grab them by the arm and whop them on the butt, right? Doesn't take any time. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. Case closed. It's over. Go your separate ways. But that's not good. Really. I mean, is it really? I mean, if you're a person that spanks your children, that's what you do. Because I know that's what I did. It was the quickest solution. Got the quickest results. Got the results I wanted. But is that what was best for the child? And I'm convinced it's not. And doing what's best takes a little more time and effort. And in this crazy world that we live in, working our fool heads off trying to make ends meet, it can be difficult. So you've got to ask yourself, is my child worth it? Is it worth taking the time to properly correct your children, to teach them, not just to punish them for doing something wrong that you told them not to do, but to teach them and help them to develop critical thinking skills, help them to understand why they should make choice A instead of choice B, and help them develop those thinking skills and the ability to rationalize through it and come to the right conclusion, to reason through it. I guess that would be a better way, to reason through the problem. So anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about. And might I suggest a book that I read. Now, my sister had a couple that she mentioned to me, and I don't recall the names right now. But there's one that I read, fairly short read, and it was very good and very compelling. Even after reading it, I wasn't completely convinced because I had those Bible verses in my head. But as one that believes and understands that we're not under the law, and understanding that the law was for the Jews and everything that went with that, I should have understood, but I just had some kind of a mental block on that. But there's a book called No Drama Discipline, and once again, I don't recall the authors. If you do a search on Amazon, I'm sure you can find it. It's also an audiobook on Kindle or paperback, I believe, and very compelling, teaching you ways to, as I said, to teach your children, to correct your children, without all the drama, just as the name implies. And I suggest that if you're still raising your kids, or if you have grandchildren, get the book. Or get a book. Look up some other ones. But get the book. All right. Well, you have a great day. I don't know why my music's playing, but good timing.